What's up everybody? Welcome back to another video, and this time we're focusing on something for post-production, and that is the Dehancer suite. Now, Dehancer reached out to us and wanted us to give an honest review. They very much mentioned honest, so we're gonna give you both our pros and cons for Dehancer, but Dehancer is a really great post-production software to emulate film and all the wonderful things that film can do for your imagery. So, aesthetics. Let's talk about aesthetics of your images. There's a lot of people that like to change their aesthetics with, let's say, their camera they're shooting on, or the lenses. Dehancer is a great way to move some of that aesthetic into post and create some new and interesting looks, whether it's film emulation, some nostalgic stuff, some print, just to give your images a little bit more life. So, in this video, we are going to walk you through a little bit about what Dehancer can do. We've got a bunch of footage from some of our old shoots that we're going to just apply some various things in Dehancer, and kind of walk you through why it is such a great program and why maybe you should be using it to create some great film looks for your stuff. So, let's get into it. One major thing to note, I am definitely not a post-production person myself. I've got some good experience here learning from Galen doing stuff, but we're gonna hand this over to Galen, who is also not a pro, quote unquote, colorist by any means. So we're just gonna go through this as a top level overview on something like yourself, if you've never used this program before, might experience going through Dehancer. So for now, I'm gonna hand it over to Galen so he can start walking you through the entirety of what Dehancer can offer you.
So I've been using Dehancer for a couple years now, and I was really excited when they reached out to have us do a video for them. It's a product that I've used on my own personal stuff and commercial stuff, so I'm thrilled that we're now getting a chance to kind of do a large overview and provide a code for you guys, because I think it's actually a really powerful program and something that most cinematographers and colorists should check out. A little bit of a disclaimer though, I think my approach to Dehancer is I see it for what it's made to do, which is emulate film. And I think that there is a little bit of a misnomer when it comes to film emulation. People have a very specific idea in mind of what is correct and what is not correct. And I think you kind of got to wipe the slate a little bit when it comes to any program that claims to emulate film, because there's a lot more that goes into it than just the color, because color gets adjusted in post, color gets altered. Even when films are shot on film, they get colored, later on, and the whole look of them changes. So while there might be a general understanding of what is like the film look, my approach to reviewing Dehancer is coming more from a what are the aesthetics of film and why you would choose to use a program like Dehancer to elevate your projects. So with that said, I'll go over some of the cameras that we shot. We used the Mini LF, the Raptor, the FX3, the Canon C200, and an iPhone to kind of show variety of the power that Dehancer has to really take whatever footage you have and transform it into something that, potentially could look like it's film. And to say, nothing is going to truly emulate it, but I think Dehancer gets you really close. And I think when it comes to digital emulation, there's a strong argument to be said that if the audience is questioning whether or not it's film or digital, you've already succeeded. So with that, let's get into it. So to start things off, I'm just gonna go over a clip that has basically every single feature that I used while using Dehancer on the clip, so we can kind of see the full shebang, everything that you're gonna get out of this program. In this clip, I have Amelia here. We shot this on the Alexa Mini, and we shot it with the Laowa Proteus lenses. And so I have two separate shots here. One's kind of a wide, one's kind of a close-up. And yeah, I'm just gonna go through a couple of the different color things that I did while grading these. So to start things off, I'm going to turn off everything. You'll see what it looks like with nothing done to it. And I'm gonna go basically node by node and explain my reasoning behind things. And a couple of the first ones are pretty basic. We got white balance, we got saturation, we got contrast, and then we're gonna get into Dehancer here. So we got white balance, we got some saturation, got some contrast, and then in this version of using Dehancer, I'm converting to Area 709 just with the Resolve LUT. turn that on. So that's what the Resolve LUT is going to give us for Area 709. And then we're going to go to my sharpening layer. And then we're going to go to Dehancer. Now, bear in mind that the reason that I'm sharpening the footage first is because, one, it's Alexa Mini and it generally needs some sharpening. I'm now going to soften it in Dehancer. So it's important that I get as much detail as I can out of the original image before I soften things up. So then we add Dehancer. And as you can see, the image changed quite a bit. Just another little before and after. So colors are shifting, things are changing. We're getting a very different look now out of it. Now, to go over to Dehancer, on the right-hand side, I have my OFX panel. And basically, I have a bunch of different tools that I can use to change the final output of the image. So you got like exposure comp, temperature comp, tint, all this different stuff. I'm gonna leave a lot of this at just like 0 or unchanged, because I like to do a lot of these kind of adjustments in previous nodes. But when we come down here, we can see Codec Vision 500T. Now I have this enabled. If we were to disable it, it's going to change the image quite a bit. Then when we enable it again, it's going to apply that look. Now, this is not a LUT. And part of the reason it's not a LUT is because you can do this. You can push and pull the film. And it's going to emulate what that's going to look like. This is one of the coolest features of Dehancer, and I think this is a really great way to create some unique looks. So I'm gonna return that to 0. We're gonna go down. Now we have Film Developer. This is another way you can add contrast, you can add color separation. For this look, I decided to just leave it as is. I felt pretty good about the way this looked without needing to tweak much of these settings. Then we have film compression. This is something you can do to basically condense the image to basically make it more film-like, which it it can raise the blacks, and it can basically change where your white point is, like the range of your image. And so for this image, I just decided not to do this. Again, this is part of the whole thing with Dehancer gives you the tools, and then it's up to you to decide what you want to do with those tools. So as we go down, we have black point, and this is a very important part of Dehancer because a lot of the time, or to disable this, now we get down to expand. And this is a very important part of using Dehancer because a lot of the time when you use different profiles, it'll change your white point and your black point quite a bit. And this allows you to then reset it kind of back to where you want it to sit. And so it's, in theory, it's kind of a gamma adjustment to some degree. And then we get to print. Now, print is a very, very, very unique tool. It's basically part of the reason why my image has the look that it has, because if I return this to linear, you'll see that we actually gain a lot of color back. We're now seeing a lot more of the image. What this does is it's simulating what it would be like to then print after shooting on film. What does it look like to then print it to film? And so this is emulating what that looks like. And I've watched several film prints in the theaters, and it's you definitely lose a little bit of saturation and you gain some punch to the image. I mean, you're basically making a copy of a copy. So, or a copy of a master, but sometimes it's a copy of a copy. You never know. But at the end of the day, again, it's just another tool. You got the analog range limiter. This is going to, again, simulate kind of like the compression that exists once you're printing to film. You can see it in the image there. It's like kind of raising the black levels and changing the white point a little bit. You also have things like color density, which you can do. You can see it's really affecting her skin tones quite a bit. So this is a good tool if you want to kind of have deeper colors without, pumping the saturation. Like for example, you can take the color density up to 100. You can drop the saturation. You can get some really unique looks. It's not for everybody. It's not for every single scene, but it's a good tool to have. And then we go down to color head, and again, I haven't really touched a lot of these tools, and it's not because they're not useful, it's just because I just tend to like to do these kinds of adjustments in different nodes, but you can do them all in Dehancer. So you can add yellow. Oh, need to enable that. So you can add yellow, you can really warm up your image. So as you can see, you can make some pretty intense changes to things if you so choose. Again, great tool, just not personally what I wanted to do with this specific image. So moving on, we have film grain. Now, this is something that I'm gonna go into a little bit of depth on, and this is one of the things that I think Dehancer does very well, which is basically it simulates film grain in a way that looks like it is part of the image. And this is a good thing because a lot of film like overlays or programs make it kind of look like it's a layer, but somehow Dehancer makes it look like it is supposed to be there. And that's really cool because again, it's that immersion, it's that believability, it's getting you closer to actually tricking people into believing that what they're looking at is film. So first tool that I would immediately address is this tool, film resolution, because if you set it to 100, it does nothing. I'll show you what the image looks like at 100. That's at 100. Then if we take this all the way down, so it's softening things, but it's softening things very lightly, almost not at all, but it's doing a form of softening. So if we start adding grain, we can really pump the grain here. We'll go to like, I don't know, 4 there, then we'll start adding some here. We'll go to like, I don't know, 10. As you can see, we're starting to really introduce tons of grain. You can see it in our forehead. And I mean, if we want to take it really far, we can just, you know, up it in the midtones, up it in the highlights, up it in the shadows. And the shadow midtone highlight is a tool that some of the other programs have, but it's an important one. It's a really great way to really control like what part of the image has grain. Sometimes you just want it in the highlights, sometimes you just want it in the shadows. It's a tool that I would kind of do scene by scene and decide what does the scene need. Just for the sake of showing this, I'll show kind of an insane look here. This is a lot of grain. And as you can see, we're now losing a lot of detail in her eye. We're now getting a very soft image. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, up to you. It's just a look. And then we have the different types. We can do positive film, which is a little more fine and not as textured, I would say. Personally, I like negative film a little bit more. But again, this is all to preference, this is all to taste. You get to experiment, and I would definitely recommend doing as many exports as you can because you're not going to get very good playback using these grain settings. It's just very taxing on your system because it's generating the grain. It's not just like a physical overlay, which again is a good and bad thing. It's a good thing because it looks better, but it's a bad thing. It does bog down your system. So now we're on to halation. And for the sake of halation, I've gone down to my output and I've put it to 100. Originally, I had it at 75. So just keep in mind that the look of it is going to change. But when you're using halation, it's important to make sure that your output is set to 100. Otherwise, the mask feature will not work. So basically, this is what we got going on. We have the mask mode, which is going to make your image dark. And then you can start to basically show where you are going to see the halation start to happen. So if I really crank this, you can see it's going to affect this part of the image. And really turn up how much I want. But less is more in this case, so I'm going to return these values to what they were and turn off my mask. And as you can see, you're getting a little bit of a red glow around these highlights. Halation is a tool that needs to be used sparingly. It is something that you don't want to go too hard on because it will immediately make your footage look wild and not in a good way, in like a you are adding halation improperly kind of way. So be light with it, less is more, and just try and localize it to the very brightest spots and don't feel compelled to add it to just, you know, like random highlights just to give it that halation look. Like this is a tool that's to be used as subtly as possible. Next up we have bloom, and if I turn it off and on, you can see that very little is happening. In fact, I'm going to turn off grain for a second just so you can see a little more clearly here. So this is with it off. This is with it on, and I'm going to turn up the amplification so you can see a little bit clearly. So if you check out her skin, we're starting to get some bloom on her skin, and we're starting to get tons of bloom on all of the shiny points on the ladder and the light as well. Now, again, it's a tool to be used sparingly. I generally do not have it set quite as high. I usually try and have amplification a little bit lower. Just so it's not like absolutely blowing out my image, but it's a great tool to have. It basically simulates what like a black promise would do. And some people even argue that it's better to do this in post now, but I don't know, you can do whatever you want. Personally, I like using Black Pro Mist. I like getting things in camera if I can, but especially with like drone shots and certain situations where I didn't get the bloom that I wanted, it's always wonderful to be able to go back and add it in and be able to add it back in with so much control. I mean, it really is a fantastic tool. You can basically create and mask out exactly where you want all of your halation to live. All right, moving on, we have vignette, and not really a tool that I touched a whole lot because it's a vignette. It's a better vignette than if you were to just do like a mask and do a vignette this way. But again, just personal preference. I don't think I need to explain this tool. It's exactly what it sounds like. Next up, we have Film Breath. Now, Film Breath is a tool that I can see being used for like kind of like the final cherry on top to film emulation, because it's basically going to every so often change the exposure of your image very slightly, and sometimes that can adjust color. And basically it's something that you will basically only notice with like damaged film or 8mm. It happened in Tarantino's Death Proof. He like allowed a lot of that stuff and kind of pushed for that kind of textured, grainy, very like kind of like beaten up film look, I guess you could say. I didn't personally use it in this shot, but I can understand why someone would want to. Now, gate weave. This is by far my favorite tool, I guess you could say, within Dehancer. It's not color, it's not grain, it's this tool. Because gate weave, it's so subtle, but it definitely is like the thing that I notice it when somebody's doing a film emulation and they have like a static shot, and you can't see any kind of like even just like slight jitter. And for those of you who don't know what gate weave is, it's basically when film passes through the gate of the film camera. Sometimes the frame is not, it captures it and it can be up, down, left, right, like it can move around, it kind of jumps around. And so it creates almost like an organic feel that you can notice on especially older movies shot on film from like the 60s and 70s. It's fairly common for, gate weave to be present in certain shots. And so it's one of the tools that I think really, truly does sell the film look. A quick side note, if you want to copy my settings, I did a lot of different testing and I found that these settings gave me enough of a jitter that it looked pleasing and realistic, but not enough that it became distracting or kind of nauseating to watch on a bigger screen. So if you would like to copy this is one version of it. I also did another version of the same thing on my close-up shot, and this is what those settings looked like. So I think you kind of got to finesse it, shot by shot, but for the most part, this is what I did. Okay, now we're back on to output. You have monitor here. You can do like false color stuff, which is great. If you're trying to get your exposure perfectly set, this is a fantastic tool to set exposure in post, especially if it was not done so on set. And yeah, I mean, I love this tool a lot. It's like a really great way to tell you a lot about your image without guessing. Even when I'm not using Dehancer for film emulation, I've just used this in general. So we'll take it back to 75, which I think is what this was at before I started doing all of my grading on it. And then at the very bottom, you can actually generate a LUT based off of what you've done in here. And this is a great way to speed up your system. If Dehancer is a program that is pretty taxing on your machine, generating a LUT of the look that you create, and then having that can be a much easier and more time efficient way of grading things, especially if you don't have a really beefy computer. So with that, the last item is quality. Normal, fast, high quality, slow. Every time I do an export, I try and do high quality just to get the best, but when I'm editing, I'd leave it on normal. Yeah, that's basically an overview of all of the settings in Dehancer, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them have been used on this clip and this one as well. So before I move on, I'm going to quickly show another alternative method to getting like film colors, which is to use the built-in film looks that Resolve has. Now, I have to preface this, like this is not, it's not like one tool is better, there's different tools for different things. This is free with Resolve, so it's just color, but just to show you, this shot right here is graded with Resolve's in software LUTs. So all I'm really doing is taking my area footage in the color space transform, and then I am transforming it to Cine on film log, and then I'm applying the film looks codec 2383 D55. And there's a bunch of others you can play with, and they're all just temperature based. But this is another way you can get a couple different looks as well. Now, it's not gonna give you any of the other features that Dehancer has, which is, again, I'm coming back to this thing of it's about the full emulation. It's not just color, it's everything. Just for another reference point, I'm gonna show you a comparison between Dehancer and just standard 709. So this is, if I were to grade it with Dehancer, has all the different stuff that I was talking about earlier enabled. Now, I'm gonna shift to this clip. This is now just straight up Rec 709 converted out of log C. Now, it doesn't look bad, but it definitely looks fairly digital. So, you know, just a comparison to have, just to see. Now I'm going to show you some side-by-side stuff just so you have a good visual representation of what these different transformations look like. Again, and I'll say it probably for the rest of the video, all of this is preference-based. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what type of film emulation do you want to have? What type of look do you want to create? And that's what this program gives you, is that control. And I think that is so invaluable. I have so much fun playing with this program, just experimenting, trying new things. And I think it honestly, you know, for what it is, provides a very, very, very powerful tool set for aspiring colorists, cinematographers just looking to grade their work. And I think even pro colorists are using Dehancer as, you know, some final touches or a way to develop a certain look. So it's really made for everybody, but for those who are just getting into color, I think this is a really fantastic way to start. Moving on to some other clips. I have some stuff shot on FX3 here. And this is just, again, we're using a different color profile in Dehancer. So on this one, I'm using codecs 250D, and I have it pushed, I have it pushed to negative 0.5. And if we toggle on and off, you can see what it's doing to the footage. Again, I don't even have this at full output. I have it at basically 65% because, as Dehancer says, and I think with any single, you know, look you create, it's good to apply the look and then kind of dial it back, because a lot of the time a look is too much and does need, you know, a certain specific tweaking scene by scene. So some scenes are going to look great with, you know, 100%, but usually not. Usually it's like 75, 65, sometimes even 40, depending on what the scene has in it. So in this one, I didn't do very much. I did my usual stuff. I can set my black point if I want. I actually thought that it was pretty good where it was at, but I might drop it a little bit here. And then I actually didn't do any print on this one. It's just what I'm getting out of the camera here. So if I were to go to the print film, it's going to become quite a bit more punchy. For this one, I didn't really feel like it was necessary, so I just left it as is. But for the most part, I usually do that. But sometimes you can do that on a separate node. Like you could create another node and then just do a certain effect on the other node, and then be able to control that a lot more finitely. Another quick note on grain is that what you're delivering is what should determine the amount of grain that you add. I mean, obviously it is to taste, but if you're going to social media, sometimes adding more grain can actually make things look better, because as I've found in my own personal testing, you gotta put a little bit more to make it show up on the phone, especially when people are viewing on such a small device. The grain being a little bit punchier, a little bit more textured, it's going to give you the appearance of the grain that you might have set differently for a larger display like a TV or a computer viewing experience. But when you're viewing on the phone, sometimes having higher grain values can help it actually show through. And the same can be said for viewing on YouTube. If you're doing a YouTube export, YouTube compresses the crap out of grain. It makes it look pretty bad. So playing around with the grain settings is important. Do some test exports, and always, 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 if you have grain on your footage, always export in ProRes, ideally HQ, because YouTube is going to apply as much compression as it possibly can to your file. So the more information you can give YouTube, the better your image is going to look. I used to do H.264 exports, and I would crank the megabits, and even then, grain looked pretty crappy. It got blocky, it just looked gross, it didn't look good. So I would say if you're gonna use grain, you got to do a really high resolution export, and it's probably going to be like 50, 60 gigs, if not more. And then you're going to be waiting a long time for an upload, but it will actually look correct on YouTube or Vimeo for that matter. There's no one size fits all. It's very, like I said, about what you're going to be delivering to, and that should determine how much grain you are using. Okay, moving on to another clip. This is a shot that I did on my C200, and basically this is just a Rec 709 conversion. I just transformed to Arri Log C, and then I basically did the traditional Arri LUT. Now, this is my film emulation with Dehancer here, and I basically did 500T again. I really like this film stock. It's probably the one I use the most, and I actually pushed it really far to the left at -2. And then I did a little bit of film compression, although not a whole lot. I just threw up the color density just to bring a little bit of tonality back in. And I expanded my black point to make sure I was hitting true black. And then I did use the print film emulation with codec. If I turn it off, as you can see, we gain some saturation back. Turn it back on, we're getting a little bit of a punchier image and some color shifting, which is what I wanted. And on this, I have the color density turned way up, because when you add this, I feel like you lose a lot of color saturation. For my grain settings, I didn't do any grain on this, not because it didn't need it, but because for the sake of showing this example, I wanted to make sure that you could see the change in color very clearly. So this is with the emulation, and this is without. Again, it's all a taste, you know, it's a fairly subtle difference, but it does matter. One note here as I'm coloring is film has a high dynamic range, generally pushing towards the highlights. So saving your highlight detail is a really important part of the film emulation, and usually with that means you have to shoot on a fairly decent camera. You know, you can get away with not the most expensive camera in the world if you have controlled lighting, but getting a good starting image is a huge part of like setting yourself up to do a good film emulation. The footage that you start with is a huge part of getting the film look. You know, if you have clipped highlights, if you have clipped shadows, you're not going to be able to really achieve that filmic look ever, even if you apply Dehancer. So this is shot on the Mini LF in open gate, and we have an expander with the unique optics, which are Super 35 lenses, but we're shooting them wide open. So we're getting this very, very, very like Gaussian blur effect going on the image, which this is not something Dehancer's doing, but it's definitely adding to the film look. If I were to turn off Dehancer here, you can see that even without Dehancer, we're still getting, you know, nice tonality, we're getting a nice bloom, things are looking good, but Dehancer adds that little tiny touch onto, you know, what I want. It gives that little oomph to give it a little bit of a different look. And I have the Kodak Ektar 25 going on here, and it looks like I have it turned down, but just for the sake of showing what it looks like more in play, I'm going to turn it back up to 100. So that's with Dehancer at 100 for this look. This is before, after, and as you can see, there's a lot going on. The last example that I'm going to talk about is using iPhone with Dehancer, because iPhones are pretty good now, and you can do a lot with their little sensors. So I have a couple of shots here that I've prepared, and I've done a quick little grade on them. So this is before. As you can see, it's, you know, It's pretty flat, but I shot it with the Moment app, which does give me a little bit of a log profile, so retaining the shadow and highlight detail. And then I did a transform to Area Log C. And then I did some balancing. Then I did the Area LUT. And if I turn this off and on, you can see that the Area LUT is doing quite a bit. But then I got Dehancer. Boom. And in this one, I've separated grain from Dehancer, because without grain, it looks like this. Not bad. You know, it's okay. Kind of got a nice little Super 16 look going on here. Basically all I did, 500T, just pushed it a little bit. Didn't do very much else. Did the usual Kodak print. This is with and without. So you can see it's, you know, we're losing some saturation. We're gaining some contrast. And then I haven't even touched grain because I'm going to do grain in this tab. So now I have my grain on a whole separate Dehancer node, which is going to give me a little bit more control over how much grain I want. And if I want to dial back this look, it's not going to dial back the grain. I feel like that's fairly self-explanatory. So with this, I have a little scene that I've shot here, and this is kind of just emulating Super 16 film. I could crank the grain probably even higher, and that would still work here. So if we were to really crank it, I could bring the grain up to, you know, quite a bit, where it's now a very, very noticeable and prominent part of my image here. So that's a pretty strong grain look, but as I've said, I think that the grain in Dehancer really, really, really looks like it's part of the image. Like, I'm no longer seeing these like sharp details that the iPhone gives me. This footage now looks pretty, I don't know, it just doesn't look as digital anymore, which I think is a good thing. So you can do a lot with Dehancer. I mean, this is all iPhone, and I feel like I'm getting some really nice colors out of here. I mean, they look pretty good to me. And you can definitely get some really interesting looks. So this one, just kind of before and after, how it was shot. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. Grain. So that about wraps up my color for that about wraps up my tutorial part of the video. I hope that you were able to get a good sense of how this program works, kind of its ins and outs, its tricks, its limitations, you know, all of the different tools. It took me quite a while to really understand the way I wanted to use the program, but as I said, I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I think there's just it being a tool, and that's what Dehancer is. It's a really powerful tool that lets you create some really amazing looks very, very, very quickly. And, you know, in a digital age, people want to get back to nostalgia. So with that, I will take it over to discussing my pros and cons. Okay, let's talk about some pros and cons. And just to bear in mind, we are talking about the full suite, not the other smaller versions of Dehancer, but the entire package. So without naming any other programs, I can say definitively that Dehancer offers the most amount of finite control when it comes to your personal film emulation. And I think that's one of its greatest strengths, is that it's not like a filter you're slapping on things. It's something that you have to refine and determine what the look you're going for is for yourself, and Dehancer allows you to do that. It's not really a program that's going to box you into, you have to do it this way, and there's only a couple controls, and then you're controlling your output. It's every single tool has a slider, and usually there's another slider beneath that slider that gives you an even deeper amount of control. So with that said, I think that's the main pro to Dehancer. I think another fantastic feature of the program is just how many features exist to emulate actual film emulation. And I think it kind of piggybacks off my first point, but basically there's no other program that's going to give you every single thing that film emulation requires, because a lot of people think it's just the look or it's just the grain, and it's not. It's the halation, it's the bloom, it's the film breath, it's the gate weave, it is the grain, of course, and obviously the color, but in conjunction with each other, the program really does the full shebang of emulating what 35mm or 16mm or 8mm film looks like. And I don't think that that can be said for many other programs. Another great feature of Dehancer is the ability to basically create kind of your own film emulation that's tailored to you. And I think a good example of this is if you actually shoot like 500T stock film, you are pretty locked into how that film looks. There's some, adjustment you can make in post, but for the most part, you're shooting film and you're gonna get what that stock is gonna give you. So let's say you spend time making a 500T emulation in Dehancer, which they have a picture profile for that. And then let's say you're like, all right, well, it's cool, but I kind of want to make it my own now. You can push and pull the film stock, and Dehancer will emulate what that looks like, and it changes based off of your exposure, your white balance, all these different variables. It's like Dehancer is constantly running an algorithm to determine how film would react if these things would be done to it. So when you work within the OFX panel of Dehancer, it's kind of in its own ecosystem. And so all the sliders work in conjunction with each other, and you're really able to dial in the exact look that you want. And I think that that is more powerful than the whole idea of film emulation. It's like people, again, going back to what I said in the beginning, everyone's got a different understanding of what that is. And so you get to decide for yourself, like what film means for you. Maybe that's light grain and some green in the shadows, and maybe you like lots of gate weave, or maybe you like no gate weave and you like to see your highlights bloom a bunch. Like there's just so many different things that this program offers, and it just does it very well. Like nothing falls short comparatively to other programs or what comes free in Resolve. So at the end of the day, you are really the one who can determine exactly how you want your film emulation to look, and I think that's one of its greatest strengths. So the last pro that I'll go over is kind of in a weird way transitioning to the cons of Dehancer, which is if you shoot film, it's pretty expensive. Like you gotta rent a film camera, and then you have to pay for the film stock, and you have to pay for developing and then scanning, and that can rack up really fast, thousands of dollars. And sometimes film gets damaged or film gets destroyed in the process, and then you have to live with that. So Dehancer's price is $450, and it might seem steep, but it's in a sense it's not, because if you're really buying into the film look, your goal is to emulate film, because you understand that it's not always the most convenient to actually shoot on film. And so $450 for a single payment, and then to be able to always adjust your footage to actually look basically almost identical to what film looks like, is not a very steep price to pay. Steve Yedlin has a really great video where he compares Arri Alexa to actual film stock, and it's basically identical. And I think that's really stuck with me, because you can use Dehancer to get that look. You can emulate film almost to a T, and then you can tell someone this is shot on film and they will not be able to tell the difference. Anyone who says otherwise, I think either has 50 plus years of experience in the film industry and has shot on film their whole life, and they just know the very small, minute details. But to 99.9% of people out there, no one can tell. I can't tell. I've watched movies in the theater. I'm like, this is shot on film. Turns out it's digital, and they're just doing a very good film emulation. So with that, I will transition over to my cons. My first con, as related to my last point, is that it's $450, and that's not cheap. For a lot of people, that's pretty pricey, especially just for a program that, is a color tool. That can be something that you kind of just think to yourself, okay, well, do I really need this? Because it's gonna be basically $500 after tax to acquire this. And no matter how powerful this program is, that's a chunk of change, and for a lot of people, that can be a little cost prohibitive. My next and last con is the speed of Dehancer. It's not the fastest program in the world. You have to have a fairly beefy computer to be able to play back your footage. I do think as computers get better, this is less and less of an issue. I can think back to when I first got Dehancer. I was on a old iMac 5K and there was no M1s yet. I had a pretty hard time getting playback, and I had to usually drop my resolution and color a couple frames and then watch it in slow playback and then go to my next clip and kind of suffer through poor playback speed. But now that there's the M1s and the M2s and soon the M3s, performance has drastically improved. But with that said, you can't slap like grain, inhalation, and bloom and then expect to get full playback in your 4K timeline. Like, that's just not gonna happen. I would say if you have a pretty beefy computer, you can pull that off. And just for reference, all the footage that you're watching is graded on a base model 16-inch M1 MacBook Pro. And unless, I think basically the only point at which the program starts to lag behind is when we start adding grain, and then we're on a 4K timeline with a lot of other nodes as well. So when you get into that realm, things can kind of bog down. But if you don't have grain on, the program runs fairly okay. It's one of those things where if you've invested into a good computer, it's probably not as big of an issue. But for most of us out there who have an average computer and aren't spending tons of money to spec out your operating system, it can be a little laggy, and it can slow down your entire workflow. All right, that about wraps up my opinions on Dehancer. I love this program. I cannot recommend it enough to people. I am constantly talking about it to friends who have never heard of it and are looking for a way to spice up their coloring. So with that, I will hand it back to Dominic, and he will take you through the rest of the video.
All right, thanks for hanging in for that video, and thanks Galen for walking us through all the cool stuff that Dehancer can do. Galen's actually the one that introduced me to Dehancer, and as a DP myself, it's been really cool watching some of the looks Galen can make with Dehancer using all the various types of emulations based on any number of things we're working on, camera, color space. It's really, really cool to see what Dehancer can offer. Now, if you really like this video and are thinking about buying Dehancer, they gave us a code, a magical code. It is NWCC10. If you use that at checkout, you'll save yourself 10% on your whole order. Well, if you liked our video, subscribe to our channel, share it where you need. We just like making the content. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.